Good morning. Good morning. And welcome, all of you. Pews, floor, welcome to, what's the name of this church again? Which one? Is it the Second Unitarian? The First Unitarian Church. Yes, good. I'm glad we're in the right spot, the First Unitarian Church. Wonderful to have you here, because without you here, there's just so much space between the chancel and the pews, and this feels great. How are you all doing today? Okay, tired. Anybody feeling good? All right. Okay, good. I'm glad. I'm relieved to hear that. I'm just wondering, because it's been a long time since I've been that age where I get to sit on the floor. Have you guys been keeping up with the news lately? Do any of you follow the news? Wait. News or no news? No news. No wonder most of you are feeling pretty good. Yeah. It's nice it's nice not to have to listen to the news. Yeah. But right now the news is kind of interesting because we have been, although the decision has been made, we have been worrying about the Supreme Court. Anybody, have you ever heard of the Supreme Court? Okay, great. One. It is, pardon me?
My mom was really mad yesterday because somebody wanted to elect that person.
Your mom was not the only one who was mad yesterday because somebody got it. I promise you that. That's why, in fact, we got a whole congregation of mad people right now. So I'm going to try to drag this on for as long as possible rather than face all these mad people. Let me tell you, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. And that doesn't mean because it's built high on a hill. It's the highest court because it's the most important court. And what they do is make sure, they want to make absolutely sure that the laws of our country are fair, because they're not always fair. Sometimes the laws are not good for people of color. The laws are not good for immigrants. The laws are not good for women. And even the laws sometimes aren't very good for poor people. And so the biggest, most important, highest court in the land is there to make sure that there is fairness for all the people in our country. Let me ask you this, though. If you're going to be a judge, and there are only 9 judges on this court, and they are judges for their whole lives. Once they get on the court, they are there until they are carried out in a coffin. Okay? So, let me ask you, what kind of person should be sitting on the Supreme Court? What kind of person? Pardon? A good one. And what would make that judge a good judge?
Because he makes a lot of fair rules and keeps them.
Fair rules and keeps them. Okay, fairness, yes. You have been sneaking at the news. Is that doesn't do bad things in college. Now, where did that come from? Where did that come from? Good. Any other ideas? No peeking now. Any other ideas? What makes a good judge on this court? So, yeah. Being fair. I think fairness is the most important. One more, Rosie. Mm-hmm. To be a good person and intelligent. Be a good person, intelligent, and fair. Yeah. And there are many people, your mom included, and many people here who feel that the newest judge doesn't fit that description. So that's why they're kind of mad. But that's what we need to go on. Yeah, go ahead. Pardon? He doesn't? No, he doesn't. Well, okay, yeah, we feel that way. Yeah, okay. So, this ends the Civics Class 101 at the Unitarian Church. Thank you for your ideas, and now it's time to light the chalice, I'd like to ask Raleigh and Kendra and Essie Lee. Is she the only one? Or is you? Then okay, great. Come on up and light the chalice for us.
To celebrate hope
and
the infinite
possibilities of love.
Thank you. Thank you all. And let us all open our hymn books, please, to number 16, What a Gift to Be Simple. It's been a long several weeks, culminating in a profound sadness. Some of us are mad, as you heard. Sadness about our nation failing to uphold its commitment to justice for all its people. Our ideals have been dragged through the mud of base politics, and our hopes of an evolving morality have been plundered by a shameless display of male privilege, power, and mockery. At the opening of his new film last Friday night, Robert Redford told his audience, "Tonight, for the first time I can remember, I feel out of place in the country I was born into and the citizenship I've loved my whole life. For weeks, I've watched with sadness as our civil servants have failed us, turning towards bigotry, mean-spiritedness, as the now normal tools of the trade. And just yesterday, Jimmy Carter posted, "America has no functioning democracy at this point." We come together this morning in our grief, sharing our despair, and grateful that we are not alone. In our meditation this morning, I really don't have a typical prayer, not that they ever are too typical in this church, but a format. What I have instead is just some ideas that I hope that we can ponder, hope we can think about. And many of these thoughts that I want to share this morning for our meditation emanate mostly from Rebecca Parker, who many of you may remember from the time she spoke here, about 9 years ago. It was a celebration Sunday. She is the former president of our Unitarian Universalist Seminary in Berkeley, California, called Star King. So here's some of the ideas that I just want to kind of just put out there. Women are acculturated to accept abuse. Women have come to believe it is their place to suffer. Breaking silence about the victimization of women and the ways in which they have become anesthetized to their violation is a central theme in women's literature, theology, art, social action, and politics. With every new revelation, women confront again the deep and painful secret that sustains them in oppression. Women have become convinced that their suffering is justified. In many women's lives, Christianity has been a primary force in shaping the acceptance of abuse. The central image of Christ on the cross as the Savior of the world communicates the message that suffering is redemptive. Suffering is somehow redemptive. If the best person who ever lived gave his life for others, then to be of value, women should likewise sacrifice themselves. Any sense that they have a right to care for their own needs is in conflict with being a faithful follower of Jesus. The promise of resurrection persuades women to endure pain, humiliation, and violation of their sacred rights to self-determination, wholeness, and freedom. The full personhood of women, as well as their rights, have been denied them. They are constantly reminded of their inferior status through language and also theological concepts of sin, including sin related to sex, for which, of course, women are responsible. didn't know Mozart could be so dramatic. Or was it you? It was Mozart. You know, the Christian message that suffering is redemptive is further complicated by the theology that Christ suffered in obedience to his Father's will. So divine child abuse is paraded as salvific, and the child who suffers without even raising a voice is lauded as the hope for the world. A Christian theology with atonement at its center actually encourages victimization. It permeates our society, as we all felt the tenor of that during the Kavanaugh hearings, that women must accept suffering, humility, and meekness simply as their role as women. And in recent revelations about the unthinkable extent of child abuse throughout the Catholic Church for centuries, I want us to focus our attention this morning on the idea of Christianity as a repressive force in our society. Now, where and how it all began, we're not entirely sure, but the odds-on favorite reason for religious repression goes back to the writings of St. Augustine in the year 400. Although famous for his work called Confession, our reading this morning will draw on his tortured work called The Literal Meaning of Genesis. So Augustine tried to figure out how the first sexual act may have been executed in the Garden of Eden. And so this reading, And Their Eyes Were Shut, is by Stephen Greenblatt, who is a professor in the humanities at Harvard University. I want to prepare you just a little bit. This is not a typical church reading. But I trust the maturity of our congregation. In fact, it's pretty outrageous. Augustine became convinced first and foremost to take the words of Genesis as literally true. The Hebrew origin story might seem like a folk tale of the sort he had looked down on when he was a young man, but the task of the true believer was not to treat it as the naive covering of a sophisticated philosophical mystery. The task was to take it as the unvarnished representation of historical truth, to make it real, and to persuade others to take it that way as well. So, plunging into the project with characteristic confidence, Augustine embarked on a work, The Literal Meaning of Genesis, that aimed at discussing, and I quote, the scriptures according to their proper meaning of what actually happened. Now, for some 15 years, Augustine labored on this work, resisting the urgings of his friends to complete it and make it public. Of all his many books, it was probably the one to which he devoted the most prolonged and sustained attention. In the end, it defeated him, and he knew it. The problem is that not every word of Genesis can be taken literally, however much one tries. And there is no simple, reliable rule for the appropriate degree of literal mindedness. So the Bible tells us that after Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, quote from the Bible, the eyes of both of them were opened. Now, does this mean that they had been made with eyes sealed shut and left to wander about blind in the paradise of delights, feeling their way, and so to reach and touch all unawares the forbidden tree too, and on feeling the prohibited fruit to pick some without really knowing it. No. It cannot possibly mean this, for we have already learned that the animals were brought to Adam, who must have seen them before he named them. And we've been told that Eve saw that the fatal tree was good for eating and pleasing to the eye. Still, Augustine reflects, just because one word or phrase is used metaphorically, it does not mean that the whole passage is to be taken in a figurative sense. But how do you know? How did Eve know what the serpent meant when he said to tempt her, "Your eyes will be opened"? It is not as if the stakes were low. For Augustine, at least, they could not have been higher. It was a matter of life or death, not only for the first parents, but also for all their descendants. And yet, there's no fixed rule for interpretation. The writer of the book, Augustine writes, allowed readers to decide for themselves. Small wonder that Augustine took so long to write the literal meaning of Genesis, and that whenever he could put his hands on it, he clung like a drowning man to the literal sense. In the case of "your eyes will be open," he was certain that there must have been, after all, something that the couple actually saw for the first time after their transgression, something not merely metaphorical. Quote from the Bible, "They turned their eyes on their own genitals and lusted after them with that stirring movement they had not previously known." They saw for the first time what they had never seen before, and if the sight aroused them, it also impelled them to reach for the fig leaves to cover as with a veil, quote, "that which was put into motion without the will of those who wished it." Until this moment, they had possessed, for the only time, Augustine thought, in the whole of history of the human race, they had possessed perfect freedom. Now, because they had spontaneously and inexplicably and proudly chosen to live not for God, but for themselves, they lost their freedom, and they were ashamed. But what was the alternative that they and we lost forever? I mean, how specifically were they meant to reproduce if it was not in the way that all humans have done for as long as anyone can remember? In paradise, Augustine argued, Adam and Eve would have had sex without involuntary arousal. They would not have had the activity of turbulent lust in their flesh, however, but only the movement of peaceful will by which we command the other members of the body. Without feeling any passion, without sensing that strange goad, the husband would have relaxed on his wife's bosom in tranquility of mind. Well, how would this have been possible, the Pelagians asked, if the bodies of Adam and Eve were substantially the same as our bodies? Well, just consider, Augustine replied, that even now, in our current condition, some people can do things with their bodies that others find impossible. Some people can even move their ears, either one at a time or both together. Others, as he personally had witnessed, could sweat whenever they chose. And there were even people who could, and I got a quote, exact quote, people who could produce at will such musical sounds from their behind without any stink that they seemed to be singing from that region. So, why should we not imagine that Adam, in his uncorrupted state, could have quietly willed his member to stiffen just enough to enter Eve. It all would have been so calm that the seed could have been dispatched into the womb with no loss of the wife's integrity. And for the man, too, there would have been no impairment of his body's integrity. Adam had fallen, Augustine wrote, not because the serpent had deceived him. He chose to sin, and in doing so, he lost paradise because he could not endure being severed from his only companion. During the interlude, I could have sworn I saw some people trying to wiggle their ears. Let's quickly take a look at some of the really important announcements. Again, just a demonstration of all this church is involved with in terms of fun stuff and social justice stuff. Young adults are going to have their meeting this Thursday night at 7:30. It's going to be my privilege to do a joint program with Maddie Rossman on Thursday night, and all young adults, which goes up to the age of, I guess, 100, if you feel young at heart, are, of course, welcome. Also note, the successful living with hearing loss is really an important aspect of this church in terms of helping people. October 18th at 7 o'clock here in the chapel, Doug Roberts and an expert in hearing will be here to kind of walk you through the astounding hearing system that we have. So if you then I really suggest that you are here on the 18th. I mean, it's amazing how just electronically it finds your hearing aids, but you got to know how it works, and there are other fantastic aspects to it. The Spice Kitchen, take a look at that for social justice. Harvest for Hunger is important, and also next Saturday morning from 9 to 11 o'clock. We have a meeting here for greeters. They're for people who have been greeters. We like to come to church and be greeted. And for those who actually think that they are capable of extending their hand and greeting people as they come to church. What a concept. It's really easy. Conceptually, it's easy. There are a couple of things that we can all stand to learn in terms of how to greet people as they come. It's important. So please, on next Saturday, 9 to 11, please come here in the sanctuary and learn how to smile genuinely and to shake hands genuinely. Finally, and so important, one of the big, fun social events of the church year, and so incredibly helpful for us to sustain this congregation financially, is the church auction, which will take place on November 3rd, right around the corner. The social hall, our Elliott Hall, is set up right now for you to buy tickets to the event and also to get a look at some of the raffles that are offered. Amazing raffles. Make sure that you get your ticket. You know, we usually have about 250 people at the event. It'll be held at the Marriott Hotel in Research Park. It's going to be a great venue, lots of fun. Mary Dixon will be our auctioneer, first woman, about time, first woman auctioneer in the history of our auctions. And receiving the Fairly Free Thinker Award will be Paul Raleigh, formerly of the Salt Lake Tribune. So please make every effort to be there. It'll be fun. And now the offering will gratefully be received, a chance to greet one another and bid each other a fine good morning. At the end of this summer, when the investigation of Catholic clergy abuse in Pennsylvania came to light in shocking ways, our progressive clergy group here in Salt Lake City was divided on how to respond, if at all. The report, which was quite graphic and disturbing, detailed the widespread sexual abuse and rape by priests of both male and female minors. Many of the priests used the language and rhetoric of their office to convince their victims that their sexual abuse was holy and desired by God. The breadth of the accusations and the explicit nature of the charges made the Pennsylvania report virtually impossible to bear among the Catholic faithful and among most of us who read the accounts in total disbelief. The Pennsylvania Files, the most wide-ranging investigation into Catholic clerical child abuse ever, covered just 6 of the 8 Pennsylvania dioceses. It suggested rather strongly that a widespread and large-scale operation nationwide was the normal practice among church hierarchy to cover up the behavior of offending priests in order to help them escape punishment or any responsibility for committing sexual abuse of minors. 300 priests were implicated by the Pennsylvania report alone, and more than 1,000 victims of abuse. And the report indicated that they had just essentially unearthed the tip of the iceberg. The report followed investigations from the 1990s, early 2000s in Boston, Washington, D.C., and around the world, in Ireland and Australia in particular. Investigations have confirmed the reality of widespread abuse by Catholic priests. Just last week, there was a new report of widespread abuse in Germany. So our progressive clergy group, comprised of about a dozen clergy, most of whom I suspect are really closeted Unitarians. There we sat and argued the merits of making a public statement to the press. Now, the name Progressive Clergy of Salt Lake City is self-imposed, unofficial. You can't look it up, which gives us the feeling of an underground movement resisting the irrational orthodoxy raging throughout the country. Conservative Christian churches, pretending to know the mind and will of God, try to legitimate a bias against same-sex partners, the transgender and gender-fluid population, women, and even the homeless and poor. And I'm sure that most of the church leaders in town like to refer to us progressive clergy by another name, probably unflattering. Now, much like the Democratic Party that can never speak with a unified voice, the progressive clergy are just as independent and vociferous in their opinions, but we did agree that all religions took a hit by the Pennsylvania report because people, especially young adults, would conclude that all religions were guilty of gross hypocrisy. Where we progressives disagreed, however, was that some members wanted to address the issue publicly by writing a letter to the Tribune that offered prayers of support for our local bishop here and the members of his diocese, condemning the abuse of minors just generally, and prayers for all the victims. But some of us thought that the bishop would not appreciate any meddling in Catholic affairs by his colleagues from other denominations. Jumping into the fray at this point was premature, and the Catholic laity needed a response from their own leaders in authority, not from those progressive clergy types. And so a letter was never sent. I wish I was glad. The Catholic Church is in crisis, affecting faithful churchgoers, priests, seminary teachers, and the Catholic hierarchy all the way up to the Pope, who now suffers a huge disapproval rating because of worldwide suspicion of his own involvement in covering up sexual abuse. I don't think anyone can predict what this next period of organizational assessment and personal introspection will ultimately produce, but it seems inevitable that grappling with such profound human suffering, willfully executed by trusted faith leaders who have been described historically as God's representatives on earth. This is going to require a lot more than prayer and repentance to restore credibility in both Catholic leadership and its doctrines. Now, complicating matters greatly is the Church's canon law that originated in the early Christian community. These laws govern the Church as well as its theology. Canon law imposes conditions on punishing priests, including, for example, an emphasis on avoiding scandal. To be clear, if a bishop were to make it known that a priest had sexually abused children in his diocese, the bishop, and not just the priest, would be guilty under canon law of causing a scandal. And whispers of priestly impropriety would prompt Catholics to question their faith, which of course is considered anathema in any authoritarian religion. So imagine this, from the very beginning, roughly 1,700 years ago, the practice of covering up unlawful civic acts were justified for the sake of not losing membership. avoiding scandal at any cost, has obviously exploded now in the 21st century, with the church hierarchy having to confront, finally, the reality of centuries of sexual abuse which have become, well, standard practice to a large degree. Now, although no religion is ever immune from pedophilia, isolated cases are, of course, discovered all the time. But never has sexual abuse by clergy been so intrinsic to its general practice than what has been revealed in these most recent investigations. Now, there's so much for the Catholic Church to examine, including the fact that the Pope has the authority to change canon law. The Pope could rid the Church of never cause a scandal in a heartbeat. But that's not in the plans, at least not for this year. The Church must also examine the absolute authority afforded to superiors in the Church hierarchy. This makes it hard to confront them, as they often end up protecting offending priests. As you can imagine, there's been just an outpouring, or just a litany, I should say, of excuses for what has happened. Excuses stemming from Mel Gibson blaming the reforms in Vatican II for loosening Catholic morality. Go Mel Gibson. To demonic temptation, where some priests lost the battle for their souls. The placing, and this is so interesting, placing too much emphasis. Why has this developed? Because the Catholic Church has placed too much emphasis in psychiatry, believing that pedophilia could be cured. All of these excuses culminating into what I think probably you and I think currently, namely the effects of religious attitudes towards human sexuality in general, and the role of priestly celibacy in particular. Now, I don't think many people fully understand that celibacy is a discipline, not a doctrine of the Church. Celibacy was a voluntary ascetic practice of early Christian monks, but not universally required of priests until the year 1139. So it took more than 1,000 years after Christ before celibacy was mandated. So what happened? Let me tell you. In a power struggle between church and state, the state being made up of aristocratic families and the monarchy, the church wanted to make sure they wouldn't lose property through marriage. So the church imposed a ban on marriage, and in their marketing efforts to convince priests and laity alike that this was a good thing, the church elevated the status of priests by implying that celibacy, oh, that was great. Celibacy served as a true sign of the priest's commitment to God. I'll tell you something else. There is nothing stopping the Pope from eliminating celibacy, eliminating the ban on marriage, other than irate traditionalists who will argue and maintain that these requirements of priests demonstrate moral superiority. They cannot argue, however, that, well, we've always done it this way, because they haven't. Although there's no conclusive finding that there's a direct connection between mandated celibacy and sexual abuse of a minor, celibacy seems a significant symptom of pathology within the clerical culture. Let me explain. It was almost 50 years ago when a report was submitted to the General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops in Rome. It was called "The Role of the Church in the Causation, Treatment, and Prevention of the Crisis in the Priesthood." After a study of 1,500 priests, the report concluded that priests suffered generally from psychosexual problems. The report made 10 detailed recommendations, none, of course, which were disclosed to the general public. Now, in the intervening 50 years, there has been no implementation of any of the recommendations. And one of the cardinals who received the report became Pope, 1978, John Paul II. My point this morning is not to discredit or shame the Roman Catholic Church, in fact, far from it. But I think we owe it minimally to a wounded society to try to understand how aspects of traditional religion have and continue to contribute to the oppression of women and children. The Christian message, generally, that suffering is redemptive, as we reflected during our meditation, justifies so many sins, from domestic violence to sexual harassment to rape, the abuse of children. How utterly flawed to even consider the notion of quiet suffering. The church continues to perpetuate its ancient patriarchy to the detriment of children and women. And so we should not act surprised by recent revelations of widespread abuse. Many men, myself included, were just as shocked as Joshua Johnson, the National Public Radio host of 1A. I don't know how many of you heard that program when he interviewed all the women on his staff, only to learn that just about every one of them had been sexually harassed at some point in their careers. And Johnson said on the air, this seems absolutely inconceivable. And I think that was probably inconceivable to most men. You know, there's still an artificial distinction or separation that men like to maintain between the flood of women coming forth in the Me Too movement and the women we actually know and work with. With Joshua Johnson, it was owning up to this disbelief that, you know, it really was this bad. What innocence. What naivete. And similarly, although just about everyone knows of child abuse practices by priests going back to the very beginnings of the church, it really wasn't until the Pennsylvania report this summer that the pathology became suddenly real and alarming. You know, I'm sure most of us grew up believing that science posed the greatest threat to religion. It's now become obvious, I think, that human sexuality actually poses a greater threat to religion than, scientific proof that shows that the earth is more than 5,000 years old. It's human sexuality that's the issue for the church. But what is it about human sexuality that the church finds so menacing? Much of religion's battle with sexuality can be uncovered in St. Augustine's writings dating back to the 5th century. Some feel that Augustine invented sex, or close to it. So this morning we heard his struggles that dealt with him trying in vain to imagine sexuality as experienced by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And it was just wild. He comes up with conclusions that went crazy, like, blaming, or not blaming, but showing, willful flatulence as proof that sex is not what it needs to be. A more thorough understanding of Augustine's anguish over sexuality stems from his own personal perspective that sexual feelings were temptations of evil. Human beings were cursed with an inability to control their passions. And he used himself as a prime example where his lust as an adolescent male could only be controlled by engaging in a long-term relationship with a mistress. And they, in fact, produced a son. Augustine's mother, a practicing Catholic, urged him to leave his mistress to marry a woman that she had arranged for him. The trouble was that the woman was 2 years younger than was allowed by law to be able to marry. So in the intervening 2 years, Augustine struggled with efforts to curtail his lust, and he wrote his famously influential Confessions during that 2-year period. He converted to Catholicism, became a priest. By the way, he never married. And he took vows of chastity to prove that he could control his passions. Because of his life experiences, Augustine was convinced that human nature was flawed. But he ascribed this flaw to the fall of Adam and Eve. In other words, their disobedience of God would have lasting effects on all their descendants. And we were actually okay as people, but it was all their fault. It was their sin, and now we've got it. Augustine's theology, well infused into a general Christian framework, insists that all newborns, because of Adam and Eve, all newborns suffered the effects of the first original sinners. There are 3 consequences. The first, you got to remember that Adam and Eve, originally when they were put there in the garden, they were immortal. But now when they got thrown out, so the consequences of their sins, 1, human beings would die and be susceptible to illness. 2, all humans would lose control over their desires and passions, and therefore could never properly exercise their freedom. And 3, humanity was exposed to the commission of sin, the only remedy being baptism. Augustine's theology also posited that marriage was part of God's plan, but only for the purpose of procreation. That is the only time that sexuality can be, in his words, blameless. All other manifestations of sex is inherently sinful. So a quick synopsis of contemporary Christian theology, formed in the 400s, maintains that human sexuality outside of procreation surrenders to the demonic. Establishing this kind of norm, plus adding celibacy to the equation as a way to control one's passion, inevitably leads to pathology with its devastating consequences that have recently come to light. So again, it's not my intention to elevate our own progressive theology above orthodoxy's worldviews. I do, however, want to make clear that contrary to the prevailing view that Unitarianism has no theological there, our contributions to the discussion of original sin and human sexuality are really quite substantial. The Unitarian Universalist sexuality curriculum, called Our Whole Lives, written in conjunction with the United Church of Christ, embraces human sexuality as something not to be feared. The toll that celibacy takes on priests, and the expectation that they live free of earthly desires, exacerbates the conflict between who priests really are and who they're supposed to be. Now, Our Whole Lives is not a sex manual, but makes one thing abundantly clear, which Orthodox theology has missed, And that is that celibacy is not lack of sex. Celibacy is about the lack of intimacy. And that's where the dangerous consequences lie. It's in the lack of human intimacy. Progressive religion today, much disdained by those who claim fidelity to God's truth. Progressive religion is not about being anti-anything or tearing down the fabric of religious tradition. Progressive religion wants to move beyond ancient perspectives from the 400s that cripple us today. Progressive religion wants to move beyond superstition so that reason can set us free, and move beyond a literalness that oppresses and actually inflicts pain on those who exist outside a white male patriarchy. Embracing human sexuality reveals neither moral flaws nor does it yield to temptation. Human sexuality is love's gift, to be accepted without fear. Progressive religion deserves a seat at the theological table. Religion must offer healing, not oppression. So be it. Can we conclude, please, by turning our hymn books to number 307? As we extinguish the chalice, may we close with these words by Sophia Foz, who's kind of the matriarch of Unitarians' religious education program. She writes, "Some beliefs are like blinders, shutting off the power to choose one's own direction. Other beliefs are like gateways, opening wide vistas for exploration. Some beliefs weaken a person's selfhood. They blight the growth of resourcefulness. Other beliefs nurture self-confidence and enrich the feeling of personal worth." Amen.